Darkness fell across the frozen valleys of Ice Age Europe more than 40,000 years ago. The wind howled through the pine forests, carrying with it the cries of hungry wolves. Inside a shallow cave, a small band of Neanderthals huddled close to a flickering fire. They had endured countless winters. But tonight, their fear did not come from the cold, nor from the beasts that prowled beyond the tree line. Their terror was reserved for something far more unsettling. Giant, human-like predators, stalking them from the shadows. Neanderthals were masters of survival. With stocky frames, broad shoulders, and powerful muscles, they had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer with skill and cooperation. Yet despite their strength, they whispered among themselves about another kind of threat, one that wore the face of man. Tales spoke of enormous humans, towering figures who hunted not for animals, but for Neanderthals themselves. Modern archaeology has uncovered chilling evidence that these stories may not have been mere legends. In Atapuerca, Spain, within the caves of Grandolina, scientists discovered bones more than 800,000 years old. The remains bore unmistakable cut marks, stone tool incisions slicing across ribs, arms, and skulls. Some bones had been smashed to extract marrow, just as hunters did with deer or bison. The perpetrators were Homo antecessor, a primitive human species, taller and larger than many of their contemporaries, and they had eaten their own kind. The shocking revelation was not that cannibalism occurred once in deep prehistory, but that it persisted. Thousands of years later, in the caves of Europe, Neanderthal skeletons were found bearing the same grisly signs. In Moulaguercy Cave in France, 6 Neanderthal individuals, including children, had been butchered with systematic precision. Their bones were cut, cracked, and burned as though they were nothing more than game animals. In Goyette Cave, Belgium, skulls were split apart to remove brains, and long bones shattered from marrow. The evidence was undeniable. Neanderthals had not only faced environmental hardships, but had also been hunted. Strongest Neanderthal, storm inside. Their blows are swift and brutal. The deer carcass is forgotten as Neanderthal blood stains the stone floor. For the giants, the slaughter is not only about food, it is a show of dominance, a declaration of supremacy. Eating their victims becomes both sustenance and a warning to all others. Such stories are not confined to prehistory. Across cultures worldwide, legends of man-eating giants abound. European folklore speaks of ogres. Native American traditions recall towering cannibals. African myths tell of massive tribes who devoured their enemies. Could these tales be fragments of ancient memories, carried across generations from encounters with real, giant humans? Skeptics argue there is no definitive evidence for such creatures in the late Ice Age. They suggest the cannibalism marks on Neanderthal bones came from Neanderthals themselves, driven by famine or ritual. But even these skeptics acknowledge that humans have a long, disturbing history of eating one another when pushed to the brink. If Homo antecessor practiced cannibalism nearly 1 million years ago, why not their descendants or their rivals? This debate is more than academic. It strikes at the heart of human survival. In the brutal landscape of the Ice Age, where resources were scarce and winters unending, competition was deadly. Different human species, Neanderthals, sapiens, and possibly others, fought not only against nature but against each other. And in that struggle, the line between predator and prey blurred. For Neanderthals, their legacy is tragic. They were strong, intelligent, and resourceful, yet their story may have been stained with episodes of horror, where they were not the hunters, but the hunted. Perhaps in their final generations they whispered of the giants that stalked them, shaping myths that would echo down to us as tales of ogres and man-eaters. As archaeologists continue to unearth the bones of our ancient cousins, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Humanity's past is darker and more violent than we once believed. The giants may have vanished, but their shadow lingers in the scars left upon Neanderthal bones, and in the uneasy knowledge that humans in every age have always been their own worst enemy. There lay a darker reality. They lived in a world shared with other species of humans. Not all of them were allies. The discovery of butchered Neanderthal bones poses a haunting question. Were these acts of survival cannibalism carried out by desperate Neanderthals themselves, or evidence of predation by another species? In Mula-Gorsi Cave, 6 Neanderthals, including children, were found with bones cut and cracked. The cuts were precise, deliberate, identical to marks left when Neanderthals processed deer or boar. Their bodies had been stripped of muscle, marrow extracted, skulls fractured. To the scientists who studied them, the message was clear. These Neanderthals were treated not as kin but as meat. If the perpetrators were other Neanderthals, then their desperation must have been extreme. Famine during the bitter glacial winters could have forced them to turn upon one another. But there is another possibility, that another species had discovered them, overwhelmed them, and feasted. In this scenario, the Neanderthals were victims of something far more terrifying: organized hunting by giant humans. The evidence stretches back even further. In the Grandolina cave of Atapuerca, Spain, remains of Homo antecessor revealed systematic cannibalism nearly 800,000 years ago. This was not occasional. Archaeologists found repeated episodes across different individuals, suggesting that it was part of survival strategy. The Homo antecessor were large, powerful, and capable of coordinated hunts. If their descendants, or related groups, persisted in isolated pockets, they might have posed a lethal threat to Neanderthals much later. What makes this idea compelling is that cannibalism among ancient humans was not rare. Across continents and cultures, similar traces have been found. At Klassi's river caves in South Africa, early Homo sapiens show signs of cannibalism. In Papua New Guinea, ritual cannibalism persisted into modern times. The act itself is not an anomaly in human history, but the notion of giant humans, larger, stronger, possibly more aggressive, preying upon Neanderthals gives the phenomenon a chilling edge. Picture a hunting ground on the European steppe. Neanderthals stalk reindeer herds across snow-covered cannibalistic. Could such tales be cultural fossils, distorted memories of encounters with real, rival species? Legends often preserve kernels of truth, and the universal motif of giants eating humans may not be coincidence. Yet, modern science walks carefully here. Without direct fossils of giant cannibals from the late Ice Age, the theory remains controversial. Many anthropologists argue that the simplest explanation is best. Neanderthals consumed each other in times of starvation. And yet, one cannot ignore the repeated emergence of giant human fossils: taller Homo heidelbergensis, robust Homo erectus, even fragmentary remains suggesting individuals of extraordinary size. This debate shapes how we understand Neanderthal extinction. If cannibalism was purely survival-driven, it speaks of their struggle in the harsh Ice Age climate. But if Neanderthals were hunted by larger humans, it reveals a predator-prey relationship between different human species, an unprecedented form of interspecies warfare. As the archaeological record grows, one truth cuts through the uncertainty. Violence was an inseparable part of human evolution. Whether at the hands of giants or their own kin, Neanderthals suffered the fate of becoming prey. And in their bones, cracked and scarred, lies the silent testimony of that brutal world. The fire in the cave still burns in our imagination. A child leans close to its warmth, unaware of what lurks outside. The clan huddles together, but unity may not save them. In a world where humans ate humans, trust could be a fatal weakness. For Neanderthals, survival meant not only enduring nature's wrath, but guarding against an enemy that looked disturbingly like themselves, only larger, stronger, and merciless. 40 millennia ago, Europe was a land of extremes. Vast glaciers stretched across the north, while to the south, valleys and plains hosted herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, and giant deer. This was the Ice Age world of the Neanderthals, a place where survival demanded strength, cooperation, and ingenuity. A world where average Neanderthals were shorter and stockier. If isolated populations of these robust humans lingered in parts of Europe, they might have lived alongside Neanderthals for thousands of years, remembered in myth as giants. But there is another, darker possibility. At Grandolina in Spain, as previously mentioned, Homo antecessor, possibly ancestral to both Neanderthals and sapiens, left bones that testify to organized cannibalism. The cut marks on those remains were not random. They were methodical, almost clinical, showing that cannibalism was not merely a last resort but a practiced behavior. If descendants of this lineage persisted, their predatory habits may have continued. For Neanderthals, encountering such groups would have been catastrophic. Archaeological sites reinforce this image of conflict. At El Cidrón Cave in northern Spain, the remains of 12 Neanderthals were uncovered, their bones riddled with butchery marks. Children as young as 2 were among the victims. The group had been systematically dismembered, their marrow consumed. Who carried out the act? The evidence cannot yet say. But whether by Neanderthals or outsiders, the scale of violence was extraordinary. Entire families had been reduced to meals. If these were attacks by giant rivals, then cannibalism was not just about food. It was about dominance. Consuming an enemy sends a clear message. We do not simply defeat you. We erase you, body and soul. This is a psychological warfare as old as humanity itself. Many modern tribes that practiced ritual cannibalism did so to absorb the strength of enemies. Could ancient giants have done the same to Neanderthals? Consider the ecological pressures of the Ice Age. Food shortages were constant. Hunting large game required coordination and luck. For smaller groups, ambushing another clan, human or Neanderthal, was sometimes easier than chasing mammoths. Humans were, after all, just another source of meat. And unlike animals, they carried weapons, tools, and fire, resources worth stealing. Legends of giants often describe them not only as large but cruel, raiding villages, stealing food, without direct fossil evidence. Yet, every new excavation adds weight to the possibility. The human story is not one of linear progress, but of competition, conflict, and survival. For Neanderthals, their Ice Age world was not only shaped by cold and scarcity, but also by the looming presence of rivals who could kill and consume them. In this dangerous landscape, Neanderthals had no choice but to adapt. They sharpened tools, deepened social bonds, and fortified their caves, But even these measures could not protect them entirely. For when the giants came, sheer size and ferocity may have tipped the scales. And in the struggle for survival, it was not always the strongest who endured, but those who could outlast and outnumber. The bones of the dead, cracked and scarred, are fragments of a forgotten war. A war not between man and beast, but between man and man. Between Neanderthals and the giants who may have hunted them. The archaeological record tells us that Neanderthals were not passive victims. They were hunters, toolmakers, and survivors who endured some of the harshest climates the Earth has ever known. Their society was built on cooperation, their lives woven together in family groups that depended on one another for survival. But even the most skilled hunters can become prey when confronted with a rival species that is larger, stronger, and just as intelligent. The question is not whether cannibalism occurred in the Ice Age. It did. The question is who practiced it and why. The butchery at El Cidrón, the shattered bones at Mulaguerci, the defleshed remains at Goyet. Each of these sites points toward an unsettling pattern. These were not isolated accidents of famine. They were deliberate, systematic, and repeated. 9. In some cases, entire groups vanished, leaving behind only broken remains. Such consistency suggests that cannibalism may have been more than survival. It may have been a strategy. If we imagine rival species of giant humans carrying out these acts, marrow extraction fits either explanation. What complicates the story are the myths that ripple through human culture. Myths of giants are nearly universal, from the cyclopes of Greek legend to the ogres of European fairy tales, from the Rakshasas of Indian myth to the man-eating giants of Native American stories. The motif persists. Humans once lived in fear of larger, stronger beings who devoured them. Could such myths be echoes of encounters between Neanderthals and giant rivals? Or are they psychological projections, a way of externalizing human cannibalism by blaming it on monstrous others? Science alone may never fully answer this. Fossils tell us what happened, but not always who was responsible. Yet the scale of violence remains staggering. The El Cidrón massacre, for instance, was not a single victim, but an entire family group, men, women, and children, all butchered. The uniformity of the cut marks suggests coordination. Whoever committed the act knew exactly what they were doing. This was not random savagery. It was calculated. If giants were responsible, then Neanderthals faced not only predators, but organized human hunters who saw them as prey. Such encounters would have reshaped the balance of power in Ice Age Europe. Every Neanderthal clan would have lived with the possibility of discovery, ambush, and annihilation. Their fires, their food, even their children could be stolen in the night. And yet, Neanderthals endured for hundreds of thousands of years. They fought back. They adapted. Archaeological evidence shows that Neanderthals were capable of violence equal to any rival. Their spears were designed for close-range thrusting, brutal weapons in hand-to-hand combat. They knew the terrain, they understood the hunt, and they were formidable adversaries. If giants existed, then clashes between them and Neanderthals must have been fierce, bloody, and unforgettable. The bones that remain tell only part of the story. The rest lives on in whispers. The possibility that human memory carries fragments of these encounters, passed down in stories of monsters and giants. The very idea that humans can be hunted by other humans is terrifying. And perhaps this is what ancient predators. By the time Neanderthals roamed Europe in their greatest numbers, the continent had already witnessed hundreds of thousands of years of human struggle. Before them came Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and even the enigmatic Homo antecessor. Each species left behind scattered fossils, stone tools, and the faintest trace of their existence. Among these fragments, one theme emerges again and again: violence and cannibalism. The most famous evidence comes from the caves of Atapuerca in northern Spain. Within the layers of sediment at Grandolina, archaeologists uncovered bones from at least 11 individuals of Homo antecessor. Their remains carried cut marks identical to those left when butchering animals: precise slices along muscles, scrapes across bones, and fractures from deliberate hammering. These people were not buried with respect. They were butchered, consumed, and discarded. For decades, scientists debated what this meant. Was it survival cannibalism during times of famine, or something deeper? The sheer number of victims and the consistency of the butchery suggested that it was not a desperate accident, but a recurring practice. In other words, cannibalism was not just tolerated, it was a strategy. If Homo antecessor was capable of such organized brutality, it raises a haunting possibility. Did these behaviors continue in their descendants? And could surviving populations of these early humans, larger and more robust than Neanderthals, have persisted as giant humans that preyed upon later species? The pattern extends beyond Spain. In Central Europe, signs of cannibalism appear in contexts far removed from starvation. At sites in Germany and France, bones show the same telltale marks: flesh stripped, marrow extracted. Some skulls were broken open to access brains, not unlike the treatment of hunted animals. To the butchers, human bodies were simply another resource. This legacy complicates the story of Neanderthals. Were they victims of an inherited cycle of violence stretching back nearly 1,000,000 years? Or did they The image of man-eating giants appears in stories from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Always they are described as larger, stronger, and merciless. Always they consume humans. Folklore does not prove prehistory, but the universality of the motif is striking. Why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, recall giants who eat people? Could the memory of such encounters stretch back to the time when Neanderthals shared Europe with other humans? The archaeological record urges caution. We cannot yet point to a skeleton of a towering human with Neanderthal bones in its stomach, but we can trace a continuity of cannibalistic behavior stretching from Homo antecessor through Heidelbergensis and into the Neanderthal era itself. The shadows of the giants may lie in that continuity. As scientists sift through caves and sediments, they uncover more than bones. They uncover a pattern of survival where violence was woven into existence. For Neanderthals, the threat of giants was not only physical but existential. If larger rivals stalked the same valleys, hunting the same game, then every encounter was a gamble with death. The bones of Atapuerca are silent now, their flesh long gone, their marrow devoured. But the story they tell is loud. Humans have hunted humans for as long as there have been humans. Neanderthals inherited that world and perhaps fell victim to it. The trail now leads deeper into the caves of Central Europe and the chilling testimonies they preserve. It is here that the story of Neanderthal cannibalism and the shadow of the giants grows sharper, darker, and more disturbing. In the damp silence of Europe's caves, the bones speak with a clarity that words cannot match. The remains of Neanderthals and their predecessors bear the unmistakable signs of violence: marks carved by stone blades, fractures made by hammering, skulls cleaved for what lay within. Each fragment is a testimony, and when assembled they tell a grim story. Cannibalism was not an exception, but part of human existence for millennia. The caves of Central Europe reveal some of the most themselves, driven by hunger or perhaps ritual. Others suggest that outside predators, giant humans, were to blame. The truth may lie somewhere in between. In times of scarcity, Neanderthals may have consumed their own, but the presence of larger, more aggressive rivals would have magnified the danger. For a small Neanderthal group, the approach of giants could mean annihilation. What makes these discoveries so unsettling is their scale. Cannibalism was not a single event, but a pattern repeated across thousands of years and across vast distances. From Spain to Belgium, from France to Croatia, the marks appear again and again. It was a shared behavior, deeply ingrained in the survival strategies of Ice Age humans. Yet cannibalism may not always have been about hunger. In some cultures, consuming enemies was an act of dominance, a way of absorbing strength or spirit. Could this have been true in the Ice Age as well? The precision of the cuts, the careful smashing of bones, suggests knowledge passed down over generations. These were not random killings. They were traditions. If giants practiced such rituals upon Neanderthals, then their victims were not only food but also trophies, symbols of victory carved into flesh and bone. Neanderthals were not defenseless. Their stocky builds and powerful arms made them formidable fighters. Their spears, though simple, were deadly at close range. They knew how to hunt, how to kill, how to endure. But their enemies may have had advantages they could not match. If giants were taller, stronger, and equally skilled, then even a small encounter could turn deadly. For Neanderthals, every meeting with outsiders carried the risk of slaughter. The bones themselves do not tell us the emotions of those who lived through it. They cannot convey the terror of a child watching their family fall, or the desperation of a group under siege. But we can imagine it. The flicker of firelight in a cave, the sudden attack in the night, the sound of stone blades against bone. These are not merely scientific facts. They are human tragedies etched into prehistory. The persistence of myths about giants may preserve some echo of these encounters. Across Europe, stories of ogres who devour children, of massive journey for food might end in ambush. To live as a Neanderthal was to live with the constant possibility of being consumed. The caves of Europe remain silent now, but their bones whisper a truth we cannot ignore. In the Ice Age, humans hunted humans. And for the Neanderthals, the shadow of giants may have been their most terrifying adversary. The Ice Age world was not only cold and unforgiving, it was crowded. Europe, stretching from the frozen tundra of the north to the temperate valleys of the south, was a crossroads where multiple species of humans met. Neanderthals dominated much of the continent, but they were not alone. Their world intersected with others: Homo sapiens migrating from Africa, Denisovans lurking to the east, and perhaps isolated groups of giant humans whose presence would become legend. To understand how Neanderthals might have faced such giants, we must reconstruct the environment of their lives. Picture endless plains dotted with herds of mammoth and bison. Great forests of pine and oak provided cover for predators, lions, cave bears and hyenas. Rivers carved through valleys, offering fish and fresh water, but also serving as boundaries between rival groups. It was a land of abundance and danger, where survival was a constant negotiation between opportunity and threat. Neanderthals were superbly adapted to this world. Their stocky frames conserved heat, their powerful muscles carried them through the hunt, and their stone tools, though simple, were crafted with precision. They lived in tight-knit bands, usually no more than a few dozen individuals, bound by family and necessity. They built shelters, controlled fire, and cared for their injured. In many ways, their society mirrored our own. Yet the very traits that made them successful also made them vulnerable. Small groups meant fewer warriors when conflict erupted. Isolation meant that if one band was destroyed, no larger community could come to their aid. And in a world where larger, more aggressive humans prowled the same landscapes, every encounter carried the potential for disaster. If giants did exist, remnants of Homo heidelbergensis or descendants of Homo antecessor, then their presence would have cast a shadow over Neanderthal life. These rivals speaks of giants who lived in mountains and caves, preying upon humans. These stories often describe giants as both human-like and monstrous, intelligent enough to use tools, but savage enough to eat their victims. Could these myths be distant memories of Ice Age encounters? Could the fear of giants have been passed down across thousands of generations, encoded in story, long after the species themselves vanished? For Neanderthals, the threat was not abstract. It was immediate and physical. Every hunt carried risk. Every fire lit at night could reveal their presence to watching eyes. To live in Ice Age Europe was to balance on the knife edge between predator and prey. The image of Neanderthals as victims should not mislead us, however. They were fierce, resourceful, and dangerous when provoked. They had survived for hundreds of thousands of years precisely because they knew how to fight. But in the face of larger and more numerous enemies, even the strongest Neanderthals could fall. And when they did, their bones were split, their marrow devoured, their bodies reduced to fragments left for archaeologists to find tens of thousands of years later. The struggle for survival in this crowded landscape was not just about food or shelter. It was about dominance. Every encounter with giants, or with rival Neanderthal groups, was a test of strength and will. Those who failed were erased, their stories told only by the scars on their bones. As we explore the archaeological record further, the evidence of conflict grows clearer. The Ice Age was not merely an age of ice and animals. It was an age of war between humans. And in that war, Neanderthals stood at the center, caught between their own kind, the rising tide of Homo sapiens, and the looming specter of giants who may have hunted them without mercy. The battle for survival in Ice Age Europe was not fought only with strength and weapons. It was fought with strategy, fear, and memory. Neanderthals, for all their resilience, understood the dangers of their world. They watched the skies, tracked herds, and scanned the shadows for predators. Ambush, or ritual, the cannibalism practiced in Europe, was part of this relentless competition. Archaeologists point out that Neanderthal bones show signs of repeated processing over long spans of time. This was not a single desperate winter or an isolated atrocity. It was a recurring reality, suggesting that cannibalism, whether by Neanderthals or by their rivals, was woven into the fabric of their lives. And if giants truly roamed among them, then the practice may have been amplified by raids and hunts that targeted entire family groups. Consider the psychological impact. A Neanderthal child, watching the dismemberment of kin, would grow up with fear embedded in memory. Stories told around the fire may have carried warnings. Beware the tall men. Beware the giants who eat us. These lessons could echo through generations, passed from one clan to the next, until they became myth. Long after the giants themselves vanished, the memory of them may have lived on in the folktales of later humans. Even today, echoes remain. The ogres of European fairy tales, the one-eyed cyclops of Greek myth, the man-eating rakshasas of India, and the Wendigo legends of North America all speak of human-like monsters that consume flesh. Perhaps these are not mere imagination, but cultural fossils, distorted memories of a time when being hunted by humans larger than yourself was a real and present danger. Yet Neanderthals did not simply surrender to fate. They fought back. Archaeological evidence of injuries suggests violent encounters between groups, broken bones, healed wounds from spears and blows, and signs of combat. Neanderthals were not passive prey. They were warriors, hunters, and survivors. But the cost of conflict was high, and small bands could ill afford repeated losses. Every raid by giants or by rival Neanderthals thinned their numbers. Every death weakened the group. Over time, the balance tipped. The presence of Homo sapiens further complicated this struggle. Arriving in Europe around 45,000 years ago, sapiens brought new tools, greater numbers, and advanced cooperation. If giants were still present at this time, then Neanderthals stood caught between two formidable threats. Violence etched into prehistory. What is certain is that Neanderthals carried this burden until their end. Their extinction, some 40,000 years ago, was not merely the closing of a chapter. It was the silencing of a people who had lived through an age of predators, prey, and giants. And their bones remain, cracked and scarred, as a reminder that humanity's past is darker than we imagine. By the middle of the last ice age, Neanderthals had spread across Europe and Western Asia. They thrived in forests, hunted across open plains, and adapted to bitter winters that would have crushed less hardy species. For thousands of years, they stood as the dominant human presence on the continent. But dominance did not mean safety. Their world was one of constant tension between themselves, between predators, and between the mysterious giants who may have lurked at the edges of their existence. The social life of Neanderthals gives us clues about how they faced such threats. Unlike the vast networks of Homo sapiens, Neanderthal groups were small and tightly bound, often consisting of extended families. Archaeological sites show that they cared for their sick, tended to the injured, and buried their dead. These acts reveal empathy, compassion, and resilience. But they also reveal vulnerability. A small band, no matter how loyal, was fragile in the face of larger enemies. Imagine the imbalance. A Neanderthal group of 20 facing a raiding party of 30 or more giant humans. Even if Neanderthals fought bravely, numbers and strength would overwhelm them. The result could be catastrophic. Entire lineages might vanish in a single night, erased from history, except for the butchered bones left behind. Cannibalism, whether by Neanderthals or by giants, deepened the terror of these encounters. To kill a rival was one thing, to eat them was another. Consumption transformed death into humiliation. It stripped away dignity and turned kin into resources. For survivors, the memory of such violence would never fade. Children who witnessed it would carry fear into adulthood, shaping their decisions, shaping their myths, shaping their very worldview. The giants loom like a shadow, predators that transformed humans into prey. Legends from later cultures echo this duality. In many myths, giants are not merely strong, but cruel. They do not simply kill, they humiliate. They eat their victims, defile their homes, and mock their memory. Such depictions may have roots in real encounters, amplified through generations of storytelling. To the Neanderthals, giants were not fairy tale villains. They were flesh and blood enemies, capable of ending entire clans. The archaeological record cannot yet confirm the giants directly, but it paints a picture of a brutal world. In the bones of El Cedron, Goyet, and Mula Gersi, we see the echoes of slaughter. In the legends of later peoples, we hear the whispers of memory. Together, they suggest a possibility too dark to ignore, that Neanderthals lived not only with the fear of nature, but with the terror of being hunted by humans who were larger, stronger, and merciless. And yet, despite all this, Neanderthals endured. For hundreds of thousands of years, they survived in this hostile world. Their persistence is a testament to their strength, their adaptability, and their will. But their story also carries a warning that even the mightiest can fall when caught between enemies, both visible and hidden. The stage is set for the greatest question of all. How did these struggles shape the final fate of the Neanderthals? Did giants play a role in their extinction, or were they swept aside by the rising tide of Homo sapiens alone? The answer lies in the next chapter of their story, where the lines between myth, memory, and evidence begin to blur even further. The survival of Neanderthals depended on more than brute strength. It relied on memory, on the ability to remember danger, to pass down stories of what had happened before. For a people surrounded by threats, oral traditions may have been as vital as fire or spears. And if they faced raids by giant humans, those encounters would have been etched into collective memory, repeated as warnings from parent to child. The archaeological traces hint at these narratives. In some caves, evidence shows remembered trauma. This interplay between memory and myth may explain why the motif of giants persisted in later human folklore. By the time Homo sapiens spread across Europe, Neanderthals were already fading. Yet stories of enormous humans who ate their enemies could have been absorbed into sapiens culture. The myth of the ogre, the giant, the man-eater. Perhaps these are cultural fossils, carrying fragments of a prehistoric reality. But what of the Neanderthals themselves? Did they also practice cannibalism against their own kind? Evidence suggests they did. At El Cedron, the remains of 12 Neanderthals, including children, showed signs of butchery. The victims may have been consumed by their own kin in desperate times, or perhaps by outsiders. Either way, the fact remains. Neanderthals, like all humans, could turn to flesh when hunger pressed too hard. This does not diminish them. It humanizes them. In the face of starvation, survival overrode taboo. The difference, however, lies in scale. Survival cannibalism is sporadic, desperate, and temporary. Predatory cannibalism, as suggested by giant humans, is systemic, deliberate, and terrifying. To live in a world where others saw you as prey, not rival, meant living in perpetual fear. That fear may have shaped Neanderthal behavior in ways we are only beginning to glimpse. Archaeological sites show increasing signs of defensive living. Entrances to caves narrowed by stone, fires placed strategically near openings, shelters positioned to overlook valleys. These are choices of people who anticipated attack. and in some cases, they may not have been defending against wolves or lions, but against their own cousins. What we see then is a cycle of violence stretching across prehistory. Giants may have inherited cannibalistic traditions from their ancestors, passing them down as strategies of dominance. Neanderthals, in turn, may have resorted to cannibalism under duress. The result was a continent where the line between human and predator was blurred beyond recognition. And through it all, memory endured. When Neanderthals were gone, Homo sapiens remained. They may have absorbed Neanderthal stories into their own mythology. Shadows behind in myth and bone. The answers lie ahead in the next turn of the story, as we step into the final chapters of the Neanderthals' struggle for survival. By 45,000 years ago, a new force entered Europe, Homo sapiens. Our species, migrating out of Africa, began spreading rapidly across the continent. They brought with them advanced tools, complex social networks, and an ability to adapt to diverse environments. For Neanderthals, who had thrived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, this arrival marked the beginning of the end. But what if the picture was even more complicated? What if Neanderthals, already pressured by the advance of sapiens, also contended with remnants of older, larger humans, the giants whose shadow lingered across the landscape? To understand the Neanderthals' fate, we must consider the possibility that they stood at the crossroads of not two, but three rival human species. The archaeological evidence reveals overlapping timelines. Neanderthals dominated Europe between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago. Homo sapiens entered the continent around 45,000 years ago. Meanwhile, fossils suggest that Homo heidelbergensis and other archaic humans persisted in some regions far longer than once believed. If isolated groups of these older, larger humans survived into the later Ice Age, then Neanderthals may have faced giants even as they encountered sapiens. The pressures would have been immense. Neanderthals were already living in small, scattered populations. Genetic studies show signs of inbreeding, suggesting their numbers were dwindling. When new predators arrived, whether sapiens or giants, the balance tipped further against them. A single defeat could wipe out an entire band. And unlike animals, these predators knew fire, tools, and strategy. They hunted with intention. Cannibalism fits into this grim picture. For sapiens, Neanderthals, and giants alike, consuming rivals was not only about food, but about eliminating competition. Every death meant more than sustenance. It meant fewer rivals for hunting grounds, fewer enemies to fight tomorrow. In this way, cannibalism was both a survival strategy and a weapon of war. Pressure. With their greater numbers and wider networks, sapiens expanded quickly, pushing Neanderthals into shrinking pockets of land. If giants were still present, the Neanderthals were pressed from two sides. This scenario paints their extinction not as a slow fade, but as a collapse under relentless assault. And yet, Neanderthals endured until around 40,000 years ago. Their persistence is remarkable. They interbred with sapiens, leaving traces of their DNA in us today. They fought for survival with courage and cunning. But in the end, the weight of enemies, both known and unknown, proved too great. What role did giants play in this extinction? The evidence remains circumstantial. No definitive fossils place them alongside Neanderthals at the very end. Yet the scars on Neanderthal bones, the patterns of cannibalism, and the universality of giant myths all suggest a possibility too compelling to ignore. Perhaps giants were not merely myths, but real predators who shaped the Neanderthals' final centuries. The story of Neanderthal extinction is thus not just about climate or sapiens. It may also be about an older, darker force, the last shadows of giant humans who hunted them, consumed them, and vanished into legend. As we move deeper into this story, we begin to see how myth and evidence intertwine. The giants may not walk among us now, but their echoes remain, carved into bone, whispered in folklore, and haunting the questions of prehistory. The extinction of the Neanderthals has long puzzled scientists. Climate change, dwindling resources, and the arrival of Homo sapiens all played roles. Yet the bones scattered across Europe suggest another element often overlooked: violence between humans. And in that violence, the giants, if they truly existed, may have been decisive players. The timing is telling. Neanderthals began to vanish around 40,000 years ago, just as Homo sapiens expanded across Europe. But in caves from Spain to Belgium, we find evidence of butchery, marrow extraction, and skull-breaking that cannot be attributed solely to sapiens. These patterns stretch back hundreds, inflicted by Neanderthals, sapiens, or giants. The message is the same. Life ended violently. In some sites, the scale of destruction is startling. At El Cedrón in Spain, a dozen Neanderthals, including children, were butchered. At Moulin-Guercy in France, 6 individuals were dismembered and burned. These were not isolated murders. They were massacres. And they suggest that entire groups were targeted, wiped out in single events. Cannibalism was more than food. It was psychological warfare. To consume the body of an enemy was to desecrate them, to send a message of terror to survivors. In this light, the giants, if they hunted Neanderthals, did not merely seek nourishment. They sought domination. Their raids may have been designed to instill fear, driving survivors from valuable hunting grounds, weakening their will to resist. The psychological toll on Neanderthals must have been immense. To live with the knowledge that others of your kind, taller, stronger, merciless, might descend upon you at any moment, would erode confidence, foster paranoia, and fracture unity. Small groups could be destroyed, larger groups could be broken by fear, and once fear spread, extinction followed. The legacy of these encounters may live on in myth. The giants of folklore are often portrayed not only as eaters of flesh, but as forces of terror who dominate humans through fear. In this way, the memory of giant raids may have transcended generations, eventually passing into the cultural memory of Homo sapiens. The stories survived even as the giants themselves vanished. Modern humans, too, carry the genetic legacy of Neanderthals. DNA studies show that up to 2% of the genome in non-African populations comes from Neanderthals. This tells us that they did not simply vanish, they interbred with us. But what of the giants? If they left any genetic trace, it is hidden deeper in our ancestry, perhaps in fragments we cannot yet identify. Their legacy may not be in our blood, but in our stories, in the myths that still haunt us. The Neanderthals end that myths of giants survived long after Neanderthals vanished, how Homo sapiens inherited those stories, and how archaeology continues to blur the line between legend and reality. As the last Neanderthals clung to life in isolated corners of Europe, the memory of giants may have already begun transforming into legend. What had once been real encounters, bloody, terrifying clashes in caves and forests, slowly became stories, warnings, and myths. For Homo sapiens, who expanded rapidly across the continent, these tales may have been inherited alongside hunting grounds and stone tools. Why do nearly all human cultures remember giants? The answer may lie in this period of overlap, when sapiens encountered both Neanderthals and, possibly, remnants of giant humans. To sapiens, newly arrived in Europe, the continent was already haunted by stories of man-eaters. They may have seen the bones themselves, fractured skulls, marrow-split femurs, butchered remains, and woven them into their own understanding of the world. For sapiens, the giants became real not only through encounters but through evidence scattered across the land. Folklore preserves this memory in strikingly consistent ways. In Greek mythology, the Cyclopes, massive one-eyed giants, lived in caves and devoured men. In Norse sagas, the Jotnar were brutal giants who clashed endlessly with gods and humans. In the traditions of Native Americans, giants often appear as cannibalistic predators roaming the forests. Even in African and Asian myths, towering man-eaters feature prominently. The consistency suggests that the image of cannibalistic giants is not mere coincidence. Perhaps it reflects a shared memory buried deep in the human psyche, an echo of prehistoric encounters with larger, predatory humans. These stories may have been passed down orally for thousands of years, shaping the folklore of cultures separated by oceans and time. Archaeology adds weight to the possibility. The fractured bones of Neanderthals bear the marks of systematic butchery. To sapiens arriving in Europe, these remains would have been visible. Imagine stumbling upon a cave filled with bones, skulls smashed, ribs severed, marrow extracted. To the observer, the conclusion would be obvious. The retelling. Neanderthals could easily become giants, their image distorted through generations of fear and exaggeration. Thus, the giants of myth may represent a fusion: the memory of real, predatory humans, the presence of Neanderthals, and the evidence of cannibalism left in bones. Together, these strands wove a tapestry of legend that has endured to this day. The question remains: did sapiens themselves ever encounter the giants directly? If small, isolated groups of archaic humans persisted into the late Ice Age, then sapiens may have fought and killed them. Victories would be retold as triumphs over giants. Defeats would be remembered as massacres, shaping cautionary myths. Either way, the stories survived, carried forward into the folklore of civilizations that would rise thousands of years later. For Neanderthals, these stories were not folklore. They were reality. But for sapiens, they became something different, a way of remembering, a way of explaining the strange bones in caves, the dangers of wilderness, the violence of the past. The giants, once flesh and blood, became symbols. As we explore this transformation from memory to myth, we glimpse how the human mind processes fear. The giants may no longer walk among us, but their shadow remains in every story of ogres, trolls, and man-eating beasts. And perhaps, buried beneath the fiction, lies the truth of prehistoric encounters that shaped the fate of the Neanderthals and haunted the imagination of Homo sapiens. The transformation of giants from flesh and blood adversaries into mythological beings was not a sudden shift. It unfolded gradually, shaped by the merging of memory, fear, and imagination. For Neanderthals, the giants were immediate threats. For Homo sapiens, who inherited a land scarred by conflict, they became stories, tools to explain the dangers of a new and unfamiliar world. Picture the first sapiens groups crossing into Europe. They would have encountered landscapes littered with traces of earlier struggles. In caves once occupied by Neanderthals, they found broken bones, shattered skulls, and fire-blackened. Cannibalism, whether by giants, Neanderthals, or even sapiens, was transformed into cultural boundaries. To eat humans was to become a giant, a beast, an outcast. Yet the myths also preserved fragments of truth. The universality of giant legends across cultures suggests that these stories were not invented in isolation. They may have carried echoes of a shared prehistoric reality, encounters with larger humans who preyed upon their kind. For sapiens in Europe, those memories would have been reinforced by the physical evidence of butchered Neanderthal bones. Over time, as sapiens spread and Neanderthals vanished, the giants themselves disappeared. But the fear remained. Myths of ogres in European fairy tales, trolls in Norse folklore, Rakshasas in Indian epics, and man-eating giants in Native American legends all reflect the same core image: towering humans who consume flesh. Each culture adapted the figure to its own landscape, but the essence remained. What is striking is how often these myths link giants with caves. In Greek myth, cyclopes lived in caverns. In European tales, ogres lurked in mountains and forests, waiting to devour children. This detail aligns perfectly with the archaeological record, where caves contain the butchered remains of Neanderthals. To ancient humans, caves were not only shelters, they were places of danger, haunted by the memory of predators who once turned them into slaughterhouses. The line between Neanderthals and giants may also have blurred. To sapiens, Neanderthals themselves appeared different, stocky, broad-faced, and immensely strong. Early encounters may have been retold as battles with giants. Over time, the image of the Neanderthal merged with the myth of the man-eater, creating a hybrid figure that persisted in folklore. This blending of reality and legend shows how human memory works. Traumatic events are not forgotten. They are reshaped, passed down, and embedded in story. The giants, whether real or imagined, became symbols of fear and survival, embodying the dangers of a world where humans hunted humans. For archaeologists today, these myths provide intriguing clues. They suggest that cannibalism was not merely Mediterranean and in the icy valleys of Central Europe. Their numbers dwindled, their networks collapsed, and their genetic diversity shrank. Yet even as their species faded, their story became entwined with something larger: the enduring shadow of giants. The archaeological record suggests that the Neanderthals' final centuries were marked by desperation. Food sources grew scarce as climates shifted and herds migrated. Sapiens, with their larger groups and sophisticated tools, outcompeted Neanderthals in the hunt. And if remnants of giant humans still roamed Europe, Neanderthals were pressed from multiple sides. In such a world, survival became almost impossible. But extinction is never sudden. It is a slow unraveling. For generations, Neanderthals endured despite the odds. They adapted, interbred with sapiens, and tried to hold on to their homelands. The problem was not that they were weak, but that they were surrounded by enemies who multiplied faster, cooperated more broadly, and fought with relentless determination. Giants, if they lingered, added another layer of danger, a constant threat of raids, massacres, and cannibalistic terror. The legacy of these encounters is written not only in bones, but in the myths that followed. As Neanderthals vanished, Homo sapiens carried forward the stories of giants. These tales served as explanations for the strange remains they found: fractured skulls, scattered bones, and evidence of butchery. They also preserved memories of encounters with Neanderthals themselves, whose size and strength could easily inspire giant-like descriptions. In this way, Neanderthals became both victims of giants and giants in their own right. To sapiens, meeting a Neanderthal for the first time may have felt like facing a monster. Stocky, broad-browed, immensely strong. The encounter could end in fear, violence, and later storytelling. Over time, the line blurred. The Neanderthal and the giant became one in the imagination of sapiens. But myths of cannibalistic giants did more than frighten. They helped sapiens define themselves. To be human was to be not a giant. Storytellers. The giants became villains. To us today, they are a haunting reminder that humanity's past was not only about progress and survival. It was also about horror, blood, and the thin line between human and monster. The next step is to follow this story to its end. The extinction of the Neanderthals, the fading of the giants, and the inheritance left to us, the last surviving humans. The final decline of the Neanderthals was not a single catastrophe but a series of losses that accumulated over thousands of years. Each winter took a toll. Each failed hunt left families hungry. Each conflict, whether with sapiens, with other Neanderthal bands, or with the mysterious giants, chipped away at their fragile numbers. Slowly, the strong people of Ice Age Europe faded into silence. Archaeological sites across the continent reveal this gradual unraveling. In Gibraltar, one of the last refuges of the Neanderthals, caves showed traces of their occupation as late as 40,000 years ago. Hearths, stone tools, and shellfish remains tell of persistence in the face of decline. But the absence of children's bones in later layers suggests that reproduction had slowed. Their communities were shrinking, not replenishing. The arrival of Homo sapiens accelerated this decline. Sapiens brought more advanced hunting technology, larger social networks, and wider trade systems. They could adapt to varied environments more flexibly than Neanderthals. Where Neanderthals lived in small, scattered groups, sapiens formed alliances across vast territories. This imbalance gave sapiens a decisive edge. Yet, the mystery of giants lingers in the background. Could remnants of earlier, larger humans have contributed to Neanderthal decline? Some anthropologists argue that isolated populations of archaic humans, robust, powerful, and possibly cannibalistic, could have persisted in Europe even as sapiens spread. If so, Neanderthals may have been pressed not only by newcomers but also by old predators who refused to disappear. The bones tell us that cannibalism did not vanish with the giants' ancestors. Neanderthal fractured skulls told their own story. Giants had been here. For sapiens who carried oral traditions and myths across generations, these discoveries would merge with their own fears. The result was a powerful, enduring image. The cannibalistic giant, the monster in the cave, the human who eats humans. Thus, as Neanderthals vanished, their story merged with myth. They became both victims and giants in memory. To sapiens, they were reminders of danger, beings who looked like humans but lived like predators. Over time, the stories grew larger, the figures more monstrous, until the giants of folklore emerged fully formed. But beneath the exaggeration lies a kernel of truth. The bones prove that cannibalism was real. The overlap of species proves that encounters occurred. The universality of giant myths proves that memory endured. Giants may not have survived into history, but their shadows remained, shaping the way sapiens understood their world. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The giants, if they still lingered, soon followed. Only sapiens remained, carrying forward the stories of those who had come before. The caves grew silent, the bones lay buried, and the legends of man-eating giants began their long journey into myth. The next chapters will bring this story to its conclusion, exploring how Homo sapiens inherited these myths, how archaeology continues to uncover the truth behind them, and what this dark legacy means for us, the last humans standing. The final decline of the Neanderthals was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of strength, played out over millennia. Each winter grew harsher, each hunting season more precarious. Herds shifted routes or vanished altogether as climate swung violently between freezing cold and brief thaws. In the face of hunger, every choice carried consequences, whether to risk the hunt, to scavenge, or to fight. And looming over all these struggles was the fear of other humans, Homo sapiens advancing from the south and east, and perhaps remnants of larger, older humans, the giants, raiding from the margins of their world. Archaeological sites across Europe reflect this slow unraveling. In Gibraltar, where some giant humans still persisted, the squeeze would have been unbearable. Cannibalism adds another layer to this picture. Bones from Goyer in Belgium, Moulin-Guercy in France, and El Cedrón in Spain show repeated patterns. Marrow extraction, defleshing, and skull breaking. While some scientists argue these were desperate acts by starving Neanderthals, others note the scale and precision suggest something more systematic. If rival groups, giants or other Neanderthals, raided these caves, the outcome was not mere survival cannibalism but deliberate predation. Entire families, including children, were reduced to food. The psychological toll of such events cannot be overstated. For survivors, to see kin consumed was not only traumatic, but destabilizing. It shattered trust, fueled paranoia, and fractured communities. Fear itself became a weapon. Giants, if they raided Neanderthal camps, did not need to exterminate every band. They only needed to spread terror, forcing groups to abandon prime territory, to scatter into marginal lands where survival was even harder. This fear echoes in the myths left behind. Giants in folklore are rarely just big. They are cruel, cunning, and cannibalistic. They live in caves, ambush travelers, and devour the helpless. Such details align too closely with the archaeological record to be coincidence. Early Homo sapiens entering Europe may have stumbled across caves littered with broken bones and concluded that monstrous beings had lived there. From such discoveries, myths of ogres and man-eating giants were born. Yet the giants of story may have been more than invention. To sapiens, Neanderthals themselves could appear giant-like, shorter but massively built, with sloping brows and immense strength. A first encounter might easily be retold as a clash with a terrifying man-beast. Over generations, the features blurred, transforming real rivals into mythical monsters. And if archaic giants truly lingered into the late Ice Age, the legends gained an even firmer foundation. DNA studies remind us that the story did not end in blood alone. Modern humans outside Africa carry up to 2% Neanderthal DNA, proof of interbreeding. The boundaries between years later, archaeologists sift through those bones, and storytellers recall the giants. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Shortly after, the giants, if they truly survived that long, vanished as well. Only Homo sapiens remained, carrying forward the genetic legacy of Neanderthals and the cultural memory of giants. The bones buried in caves testify to the violence. The myths passed down through generations testify to the fear. Together, they paint a picture of a world in which the greatest threat to humans was not beasts of the wild but other humans, sometimes larger, sometimes stronger, always dangerous. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with stories, whispered from fire to fire, about those who came before. Stories of giants who ate men, of monsters in caves, of battles long forgotten. In these stories, the Neanderthals lived on, not as themselves but as shadows, fused with the giants who may have hunted them. And through those stories, we too inherit the memory of a darker, bloodier human past. With the Neanderthals gone, the Ice Age world belonged to Homo sapiens. Yet the shadows of the past remained. Across Europe, caves still held the bones of those who had come before, fractured, burned, and broken. For the sapiens who stumbled upon these sites, the evidence was unmistakable. Giants had once lived here. Giants who ate men. The imagination of early sapiens needed no encouragement. They were a storytelling people, already weaving myths and symbols into their lives. When they saw skulls split for brains, femurs cracked for marrow, and skeletons scattered like discarded carcasses, they did not view it through the lens of archaeology. They viewed it through the lens of fear. The conclusion was inevitable. Monstrous beings had feasted on humans in these very places. And so, myths of giants became part of their inheritance. In every campfire tale, the giants grew taller, their hunger greater, their cruelty more terrifying. Stories that may have begun as memories of encounters with Neanderthals or with older, larger humans transformed into the legends we know today. Ogres, trolls, rakshasas. They left symbolic objects, carvings, ochre, tools, as if to overwrite the darkness with meaning. By doing so, they turned sites of fear into places of memory, embedding their own narrative atop the bones of giants. But the bones themselves tell another story, one that cannot be erased by myth. The cut marks, the fractures, the burned surfaces, they confirm that cannibalism was not legend but fact. Humans ate humans. Whether it was Neanderthals devouring their own, sapiens preying on rivals, or giants raiding weaker groups, the outcome was the same: violence carved into bone. This duality, myth and evidence, story and scar, is at the heart of our understanding of prehistory. The giants of folklore may not match the fossils we unearth, but both point to a reality too grim to ignore. Cannibalism shaped human evolution. It was a tactic of survival, a weapon of war, and a source of enduring fear. For sapiens, who inherited the earth, the giants became a way of explaining the darker side of humanity. They externalized cannibalism, projecting it onto monstrous others. In myth, it was not humans who ate humans. It was giants. In this way, sapiens distanced themselves from the horror, preserving the memory while denying responsibility. Giants became scapegoats for a truth too uncomfortable to face. And yet, deep down, sapiens knew the truth. The bones in the caves, the scars on the fossils, the echoes of fear in every culture, they all spoke the same message. The giants were real, whether as separate species, as Neanderthals transformed in memory, or as symbols of our own capacity for violence. Their legacy was not only in the bones of the past, but in the minds of the living. As sapiens spread across the globe, they carried this legacy with them. Wherever they went, giants appeared in their myths. In the Americas, the Site-Ka were said to be red-haired cannibal giants. In Polynesia, tales spoke of man-eating ogres on distant islands. In Africa, legends of towering predators haunted villages. Across every continent, the giants walked again, not in flesh, but in story. The Neanderthals were gone. The giants vanished. Marrow extracted, skulls cracked. Some victims were Neanderthals, others sapiens themselves. Cannibalism was not the invention of folklore, but a recurring feature of Ice Age survival. Giants may have embodied this truth in story form, allowing sapiens to face the horror indirectly. By externalizing cannibalism, sapiens created monsters out of memories. Giants became the ultimate other, the embodiment of everything humans feared in themselves: brutality, hunger without restraint, violence without morality. By telling stories of giants, sapiens could teach their children what lines must never be crossed, even while acknowledging, silently, that those lines had been crossed before. The myths grew, transforming across cultures but always retaining the same core image: human-like predators who devoured flesh. In northern Europe, trolls and ogres lurked in mountains and forests. In Greece, the cyclopes lived in caves and feasted on men. In Asia, rakshasas and yakshas consumed the unwary. In the Americas, giants stalked the plains and devoured travelers. This consistency is astonishing. Across continents and centuries, humans remembered giants the same way, as cannibalistic enemies. This memory served a purpose. By painting cannibalism as monstrous, sapiens reinforced social cohesion. Communities bound themselves together in opposition to the giants, both real and imagined. To be human was to reject the ways of the giants, to embrace kinship, cooperation, and compassion. In this way, the giants, though gone, continued to shape human identity. And yet, whispers of truth remained. Some legends preserve remarkable detail, as though they originated from first-hand encounters. Native American traditions describe giants who ambushed families, devoured children, and lived in caves, details that echo perfectly with what archaeologists uncover in Europe. Could these myths, carried across thousands of years and miles, be distant echoes of a shared human past? Could they be memories of a time when multiple human species coexisted, competed, and cannibalized one another? If so, the giants of myth are not pure fantasy. They are distorted reflections of real beings: Neanderthals, archaic humans, or even Homo sapiens themselves, who once pressure that tipped the balance. For Homo sapiens, who inherited the world, the giants became part of their story. They survived while others vanished, but they carried the memory of their rivals. This memory shaped myths, morals, and even our sense of identity. The giants taught us what it meant to be human by showing us what we must never become. Today, when we tell stories of ogres in caves or trolls under bridges, we are not merely entertaining ourselves. We are echoing the fears of our ancestors, replaying the trauma of encounters long past. The giants may no longer walk the earth, but they live on in us, in our DNA, in our bones, and in our stories. The tale of the giants is thus more than legend. It is a chapter of human history, one written in blood and remembered in myth. And as we turn to the final chapter of this documentary, we will confront the ultimate question. What does the story of giants and Neanderthals reveal about us, the last surviving humans? The story of giants and Neanderthals is not only about the distant past, it is about us. When we peer into caves littered with broken bones, when we trace the myths of ogres and trolls across cultures, we are not just studying others. We are looking into a mirror, confronting the darkest aspects of our own nature. For thousands of years, the giants haunted the imagination of early Homo sapiens. They appeared in every story, every warning, every tale told around the fire. Some were described as towering brutes, others as cunning tricksters, but all were united by one trait: their hunger for human flesh. The universality of these myths suggests that they were not pure fantasy but rooted in real memory, real fear, and real encounters. The archaeological record supports this interpretation. Cannibalism was not a rare aberration. It was a recurring practice throughout human prehistory. Neanderthals consumed Neanderthals. Homo antecessor butchered their own. Even Homo sapiens, in moments of desperation or ritual, turned to flesh. The giants of myth distilled this reality into a single figure, allowing humans to remember the horror without admitting their Neanderthals deepens the connection. Modern humans carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA, a reminder that they did not vanish entirely. They live on within us, influencing traits from immunity to skin tone. The giants, however, may have left no such trace, or if they did, it lies hidden in the deep complexity of our genome. Their clearest legacy is cultural, preserved in myth. The bones gave us facts. The stories gave us meaning. Consider the symbolism of caves. To Neanderthals, caves were homes and shelters. To sapiens, they became the lairs of giants. Even today, we associate darkness, caverns, and wilderness with monsters. This fear is not irrational, it is ancestral. Our forebears learned to fear caves because they were places of danger, where predators, human or otherwise, could lurk. The myths of giants carried this lesson forward, embedding survival strategies into culture. The more we study this intersection of myth and evidence, the more we see that the giants are not simply about the past. They are about the fragility of humanity itself. They remind us that the line between human and monster is thin. In times of scarcity, humans can become predators of their own kind. In times of fear, humans create monsters out of memory. The giants embody both truths at once. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we must ask, what does it mean that our earliest stories are about cannibals, ogres, and giants? What does it reveal about the foundations of human culture that we chose to remember terror more vividly than triumph? Perhaps it tells us that survival was never guaranteed, and that fear was the most powerful lesson of all. The Neanderthals are gone, the giants are gone, but their memory lingers in our genes, in our bones, and in our stories. They are part of us, whether we wish to admit it or not. And to understand them is to understand ourselves. The final part of this documentary will bring together the threads of evidence, myth, and meaning, offering one last reflection on the legacy of giants and the humans they consumed. Capacity for savagery. The myths ensured that the memory of giants would never be lost. In Europe, ogres and trolls. In Asia, rakshasas and yakshas. In the Americas, man-eating giants of the plains and forests. In Africa, towering hunters who stalked villages. Across cultures, separated by oceans and time, the image remained the same: monstrous humans who devoured flesh. This universality is our greatest clue. It tells us that the giants were not inventions of imagination, but shared memories of ancient encounters. Why do these myths matter today? Because they remind us that we carry within us both the victim and the predator. We are the descendants of those who feared giants, and perhaps also of those who acted like them. The line between human and monster runs through our own history. By remembering giants as external beings, We shield ourselves from the truth that cannibalism was once part of our survival. Yet the bones do not lie. They show us what we were capable of, and perhaps still are. The Neanderthals, too, live on in us. Their DNA flows in our blood, their story carved into our past. They were not failures of evolution, but survivors of unimaginable hardship, undone only by the combined pressures of climate, competition, and conflict. If giants played a role in their downfall, then their extinction is also the story of a forgotten war, one in which humans themselves were the ultimate predators. The giants may never be found in full skeletons or perfect fossils. Their existence may always remain half shadow, half memory. But their legacy is real. They shaped the myths that guided sapiens, the fears that defined morality, and the stories we still tell. Every ogre in a fairy tale, every monster in a cave, every tale of man-eating beasts is a reflection of that ancient truth. Once, long ago, we were prey. And so, the documentary ends where it began, in the dark of an Ice Age cave. The fire flickers against stone walls, illuminating bones scattered across the floor. To the people who once lived here,